Good morning, Windermere. I'm Charlotte Baliatico, and Jeannie Hilscher and I are the co-chairs of this season's speaker series. Today we'd like to welcome you to our first Cocktails and Conversation, A Story of a Holocaust Survivor by Robert Nossen. I might add that Robert was recently a guest on Wink News and told his story there as well. Due to COVID, we are unable to bring you this presentation with a live audience, and nor are we able to bring you a virtual cocktail. However, with the help and support of the Windermere staff, and particularly Mark Neneman, our communications director, we are able to bring you this today in the comfort of your own home and perhaps even with your own cocktail. I would be remiss today if I didn't mention that one of our former members, Ann Jacobson, was a founder of the Holocaust Museum and also a former board member of, in fact, the first female board member at Windermere. With the help and support of Sam Parrish, the director of Operations and Educational Specialist at the Holocaust Museum, we are honored today to have as our guest Mr. Robert J. Nossen, and he will be here to present to you his story as a Holocaust survivor. So I'd like to thank Mr. Parrish for all his help, and thank you, Rob, for being with us here today.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte, for giving me the opportunity, and Jean. It's Jean, right? Jeannie, for giving me the opportunity to speak, even though it's virtual. I'm doing a lot of that now. But just a little background about the museum. It's surprising how many survivors were down here. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But there was a program, and the museum actually started as a school program, out of a school program. The program was in 1997, and it involved 8th graders, and there were 2 people involved in the thing, and there was, I'm trying to remember the names, but off the top of my head, I wasn't ready for that. But in any event, it was a school program. And they came up with an exhibit, a whole exhibit, as part of a narrative about the Holocaust. And that became, because Florida, by the way, is one of 12 states that requires the teaching of the Holocaust, generally in the 8th grade. So they came up with this program and went around and presented to the Jewish community. And then it kind of languished, it's stored. But several years later, there was, the idea came up for maybe we should take this as a basis for the museum. And much of the stuff initially that came out of that came from that source, the program. Years later, several years ago, we honored the 2 people that were involved, and the school teachers that were, one was an art teacher and the other one was, I guess, a social studies teacher. The museum actually officially started, I believe, in 2001, okay? And where we are today is our 3rd site. The one you're most familiar with is the one, and the longest where we were, is the one that was on 41, on 4700 block. Before that, for a short period of time, it was in Tanglewood, in the Tanglewood Center. And we moved into our present location, which is on Imperial Golf Course Boulevard, which is about a mile north of, above Immokalee Road, in July of 2019. And opened to the public in September of 2019. So, and that one is actually, it is a condo association, and we own, now, before we were renting, now we own the units, and in fact, we bought additional units recently. That's the museum that most of people are not familiar with. We're trying to get more people, but obviously the COVID has hit us as much as anything. We are open on a limited schedule. We make, basically with the reservations. We are now also doing have school groups coming in limited numbers. But it used to be that, particularly in season at this time of year, we get 100 people in, and I've had that many people on the tour at one point. That was a little too much, but depending on the season, it really depends on. So we're open as a museum to the public. We're generally open only in the afternoon, and the reason for that is that our focus. We reach out to the schools, private groups, and so forth, and we generally have a lot of children, schools groups coming in as a class in Collier County. They'll bring a busload of students in. We split them in two groups, and they spend the morning with us, for example. So that's always been our goal, and we end up having, under normal circumstances, we will have 15 to 20,000 students going through the museum, and roughly 10,000, maybe been about 10,000 general public in a year. Last year was an exception. The last year before March was an exceptional year for us, far exceeded anything else. So we are trying to stay open as much. We closed down initially, and then we opened up again on a limited basis. We are open now 4 days a week. You can sign up for the museum. We're trying to have people sign up so that by just logging into the Holocaust Museum website. But we always have people walking in, because we're limiting the number of people. So I got started with the museum. I was a member, I joined in 2001 and attended some of the events, and then I became a docent in 2005. And what the museum has done is record extensive recordings of survivors within the community, their stories. And, it could be 2 hours recording. And that's still available. And we've made synopsis of, we've summarized quite a few of those on our website now. And some of them are more extensive. And as I said, there are surprisingly for Naples, for a community the size of Naples, there are, first of all, quite a few Jews and quite a few survivors, relatively speaking, because obviously for the weather and so forth. So we have had a very active program with the survivors. We involved in programs, the Yom HaShoah program at Holocaust Remembrance in January, Yom HaShoah programs and such and so forth. And we go into we deal with also collaborate with Temple Shalom on a lot. So my story is somewhat different than most, because I was born in Amsterdam, Holland, or Netherlands as it's officially known, but most people that live there always called it Holland. But that's the official name is Netherlands. And my story actually goes back to my parents' story go back to 1930, before 33. My parents and my families lived in a place called Silesia, which was in eastern Germany, and the families lived there for generations. And my father was the first in his immediate family that went to university. He was born in 1903, and he ended up getting a doctorate degree in chemical engineering. That is important because much of our success, our survival ended up being due to that as well. My mother came from a relatively well-to-do family. Her father owned a cigar factory in Silesia, And so she never worked. At that time, women didn't work anyway. They married in 1926. No, they married in 29, I guess. My brother was born in 1930, and I was born in 1938. My brother was born in Germany, and everything was fine. My father had an excellent position. And what happened in 1933, Hitler came to power. When Hitler came to power, many Jews in Germany thought this too shall pass. Now, there was a lot of friction. And in Germany, prior to the First World War, and even afterwards, most of the Jews were fully assimilated. Most were what we call Reform Jews. Many of them had intermarried. Many of them had converted. I have a first cousin who converted, whose mother converted before she was born, before the war. So, and this was not only that. I have an aunt by marriage, through marriage, or cousin, depending on how you define it, who is now a saint in the Catholic Church. Saint Teresa, whatever, one of those saints. She was made saint several years ago. And it was kind of interesting. The fact it highlighted something about the Nazis, that it wasn't a religion. They went after the Jews not because of religion, but because of racial or identity. So even though she had given up religion and became a nun, actually, she eventually ended up in Auschwitz. So you can imagine what that was. But that's a side story, really. But in 1933 already, my father, was told, get out of Germany. He saw what was happening. You had the boycott of Jewish stores. You had the burning of Jewish books or Jewish content, books with Jewish content. And they also had they started going after, the anti-Semitism became extensive. Before that, Jews had a great life there. Yes, there was anti-Semitism, but they represented a very highly group of educated people. They were fully, as I said earlier, they were fully assimilated. A higher proportion of Jews fought in the First World War than any other group. So they were in the military as well and so forth. So they considered them, and they had full citizenship, so that was not an issue. And so what changed? When Hitler came to power, he started going after the Jews, and my father's boss said, hey, we got subsidiaries in other countries. Why don't you, I think it'd be a good idea if you go. So in the fall of 1933, my parents moved to Denmark. That's one of the places. But because of work permits, they could only stay for 18 months. Then they ended up going to Belgium on a similar point. There was another subsidiary there. And then finally, my father took a job in Amsterdam, Netherlands, or Holland, as I would prefer to call it. It's shorter. But in 1936, and my father went to work, and at that time, on bicycle, and took a ferry across to the island where we went. And my brother was in school, regular school, and I was born, as I said earlier, I was born in 1938. So we had a very comfortable life there. And actually, it was a good life, and we knew a lot of what was going on. My parents knew a lot of what was going on in Germany because most of our family was still there. They started coming out in 1937 or so. They started coming out. So some of them made it to the United States. Some of them ended up in other countries over a period of time. And 15 of them eventually ended up in Holland, about 15 in total, including my grandparents, on my father's side, as well as other relatives, mostly cousins of my father, first cousins of my father. My mother had two sisters. And my father had two brothers. One ended up in a place called the Shanghai Ghetto in 1939, 38, 39. And my mother's other sister originally ended up in the Dominican Republic, and then got to the United States about a year later, and ended up settling in Alabama. They had a sponsor who was a Supreme Court justice, had been a Supreme Court justice in New York. And so he got him a job, got my uncle a job in Alabama. Well, as soon as he was able to, they moved up to New Jersey. And they became our sponsors when we came over in 1948. So we were in Amsterdam. It was very comfortable. We had a very nice apartment, with a garden and everything like that. And life was, as I said before, life was good. Well, in 1940, things started, well, it started already before that. In 1938 and 39, after Kristallnacht, family members that hadn't gotten out before that were trying to get out. And many of them ended up quite a few of them ended up in Amsterdam. So by the time 1940, there were 15 of us there. But Holland didn't expect to be invaded, because in the First World War it was neutral. Even after 1939, when the invasion of Poland, and Germany and Holland share a long border. The languages are somewhat similar. The identity is similar. And at one point, I was told that Hitler was talking about annexing Holland into Germany. That didn't happen, obviously. So what changed was the war started in September 3rd of 1939, but nothing happened on other than the invasion of Poland, nothing happened on the Western front, quote-unquote Western front. The only thing that changed was that Britain sent about 400,000 soldiers over to France. But in May 1940, Hitler invaded Western Europe. And Holland fell, because it was an avenue to get into France, Holland fell in 5 days. They firebombed and destroyed Rotterdam completely. And they had a beautiful city, and if you go there, very little of the old city is left, if anything. And then they threatened to firebomb other cities as well, including the capital. And so Holland surrendered in, as I said, 5 days. Then the Germans went into Belgium. They lasted 14 days. And then they got to France. And France fell on June 23rd, or surrendered on June 23rd, I believe, of 1940. So a very short time frame between May 10th and June 23rd. That's how fast it went. In the meantime, they also went into Denmark. They went into Norway, Luxembourg, and so forth. So they all, and France, obviously. The Dutch, so we were isolated. We tried to get to the coast to get over to England, because in the meantime, my aunt and her husband had gotten over through Quakers, had gotten to England. And by the way, that's another story. And she was the one that converted. So, my aunt. And but we couldn't get out fast enough. The roads were blocked and everything like that. So we were stuck. And slowly but surely, things got worse for the Jews in Holland. The first year, they kind of left us alone. But we had to register. The families had to register, so they knew where the Jews were. And in 1941 they started. But many of the Jews ended up in a place that came to a place called Westerbork. And Westerbork was after Kristallnacht in 1939 was set up as a refugee camp, typical refugee camp, and so forth. I'll get back to Westerbork because eventually we went there. But so at the start of the war, there were 15 of us there. And of the 15, my brother, myself, and my parents were the only survivors. My grandmother died of natural causes in 1942, but the others all ended up in the camps and did not survive. So in 1941, they came with the first restrictions: not allowed to go in public parks, sports places, swimming pools, restaurants, drive cars, and travel outside of town limits. That's why when my grandmother died in 1942, we had to get special permission from the Germans to bury her outside the city limits, because that's where the cemeteries were. They were outside the city limits. In fact, that was also in 1942 when, although there were no ghettos, there was officially at least, Amsterdam actually became, in 1942, became the ghetto for all of Jews in Holland. Before that, they were allowed to stay where they were. But we continued to live in the same house that my parents had lived in since 1936. But these were all started in 1941. In 1942, they came in with the Jewish Star in Western Europe. And that was throughout Western Europe. Also, they separated the Jews from the community. The rest started separating the Jews from the rest of the community, including schools. So my brother could no longer go to school. And that's when the Jewish community set up its own schools in 1942, and that lasted for about a year. That was the school that we were talking about Anne Frank going to the same school. They were about a year apart. So we were stuck. And the idea of moving all the Jews to further, this is after they came up with the final, what we call the final solution, the gas chambers and so forth, okay? That they came up with this problem. And they were starting in 1942. They started deporting people, generally the elderly first, to this place, Westerbork, which they then became a transit camp rather than it was already in place as a refugee center, and they formed it into a transit place where Jews were first sent there, and from there they went to concentration camps or other places, or even Auschwitz, or ghettos. From there, there were in Western Europe. There were different. In every country had its own transit camps set up that were occupied by the Germans. So that's how it ended up being the case. My grandfather we were restricted. We had people have to buy food for us. We couldn't, and many of the people that had some freedoms were those in mixed marriages. And they were treated differently. They were never deported. They were restricted, but they had some more access than others. But you basically were living like we are now, in a sense. I mean, it's kind of interesting because we know people down here, they're living in places like Arbor Trace or the Carlisle, and the restaurants and everything is closed. They bring their meals to the rooms, or their apartments. But there was the case where others helped us get the food. My father continued to work, though, throughout this time, because his company, as I said, he was an engineer, and his company, he was working with batteries and stuff like that, and his company had been taken over by the German army doing defense, and so forth. So they said they needed him. in January 1943, but then they started, as I said, in 42, they started with the deportations and this movement of all the Jews of Holland. Now, Holland had a high concentration of Jews, higher concentration than Germany. In Germany, the Jewish population represented about 1% of the total population, okay, mostly living in the cities. In Holland, the number was over 2%, maybe closer to 2.5% of the population. And then there was an influx. At the time, official number was about 130,000 in the war. So my brother went to school, and my mother, and that's also when they started the first deportations to, as I said. And some people went to different camps. So you could go to Auschwitz, you could go to Theresienstadt, and I'll talk about a little bit more about Theresienstadt separately. Or you could go to Bergen-Belsen or other camps as well. But this is the first thing you went to the state. And you went on a regular passenger train initially. Then you went there, they had train service. And then you went from Theresienstadt, you ended up going by boxcar, the typical boxcar, wherever you were going to go. Actually, then they started, later on, they were also using the boxcars from the train station in Amsterdam as well. That was the gathering point also. In January of 1943, my grandfather was taken, and we never heard from him again. My mother tried to stop them from taking him, and they came to our neighborhoods in trucks with German and Dutch police, because the Germans didn't know where the Jews were, necessarily knew exactly their way. And they would come really into the neighborhoods and round up the Jews. Okay, as I said, the ghetto, we were living in the same house at that point. So we ended up, my mother tried to stop him. And what happened was they threatened her if she didn't stop, they would take her as well. And I was with her when that happened, because she was home, my father had been at work, and my brother was still in school. In June of 1943, there were major roundups of Jews, not just in Holland, but in all of Western Europe, starting in July of 1943. And my sister-in-law, for one, her parents were Polish, but she was born in Germany, so she was considered Polish. By the way, there is no birthright in Europe, pretty much all of Europe. So in the 10 years I lived in Holland, I never became a Dutch citizen. I could become one at 18 by filing papers. And my parents were always considered German. And there were no opportunities to really become Dutch. Not that it affected our situation, but that's the way it was. So we were rounded in that roundup in June of 1943, which, by the way, coincided with the time when they had cleaned out the ghettos, pretty much. Most of the ghettos were gone. This is soon after the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. So that's when they started going after the Jews in earnest. They had basically gotten rid of all the Jews in Poland. You had your and Eastern, pretty much many of the ones in Eastern Europe that were not in hiding and so forth. They had killed about 1.5 million Jews by gunfire and so forth in the East, in Ukraine, Belarus, and so forth. But Poland, most of the Jews ended up in the ghettos. There were over 600 ghettos in Poland. And most of the Jews ended up being rounded up there and sent from the ghettos to the death camps primarily. Mostly, there were some that are being sent also to concentration camps in the East, in Germany. Just as a side, there were only 2 or 3 concentration camps in Poland The rest of the camps were all pretty much in Germany and Western Europe, primarily Germany. So when some of them were Auschwitz and Majdanek. There were several camps that were actually concentration camps as well as death camps. So we were taken to Theresienstadt. I have pictures of that, by the way. And it was an internment camp. It was relatively comfortable by standards, the food and so forth, because it had been set up as a refugee camp. So they had kitchens set up and so forth. And my father started working in a laboratory there and on the sanitation system and water systems. And we were there until September. Rather than being sent out, we were there from June until September. And in pressure from my father's company, we were allowed to go back to Amsterdam in September of 1943. Now, in the meantime, we've lost everything. All of our possessions were gone. My school was out because they closed the Jewish schools at about the same time in June of 1943. So there was no place to go. My father's company found us an apartment, and my father went back to work. But we had nothing else we could do. And the reason that we were also, there are a couple of things that helped us. One, we were on the Palestine List. And the Palestine List worked through Geneva, through Jewish organizations in Geneva. And there was a list of Jews, German Jews primarily, who would go to Palestine once the British would allow them to go. But the British had set up quotas for Jews and would only allow in about 1,500 a year. So there was a list, but most of it was not being used. And we were on it. My brother and I were on it as well. We got in on it also eventually. So that list never worked. But in the meantime, in the spring of 1943, my father heard from a friend that he had gotten El Salvador certificates of citizenship. There was the Consul General in Geneva for the El Salvadoran government, Colonel Castellano. It was a program we ran at the museum, and I was recorded for that. We ran it, actually, it was a luncheon program, a virtual luncheon program, and we had a program on that in December. So my father applied for citizenship to the Castellano, and we found out that he was handing out citizenship papers to Jews, and he handed out thousands. It's actually a certificate of citizenship. It's a one piece of paper. Now, there were a lot of others, the consuls, they handed out visas to Jews, but this was different. Most of them handed out visas, but he handed out citizenship certificates. So my father applied for it before we ended up going into Westerbork. But we never heard anything. But then when we came back to Amsterdam, we got from the Jewish community, because there still was a Jewish council there, that we found out they had gotten the papers. And there was mail service. You could communicate with different organizations. So we got the certificate of citizenship, which basically changed our lives right away, because now we were considered a foreign national rather than Jewish. So we were still restricted, but we had more freedom. We could go shopping and stuff like that. And my father rode his bicycle down to the ferry and would go to work every day. And so we were fortunate. We ended up being, that's how we were until, we still wore the Jewish star. We still had to wear that, obviously. But because of these papers, which they carried, they gave us more, as I said, more freedom. Until the end of August of 1944. Now, when the Allies came ashore in France in 1944, in June of 1944, they started liberating France, and then liberated Belgium, and then got to the southern part of Holland, the southern half of Holland, more than that actually, and liberated that, and then decided, because the border to go directly and to go into Germany, and left the area of Amsterdam and the surrounding area alone. And they said, well, we'll worry about it afterwards. So we were stuck. So in the beginning of September, then the last 5,000 Jews that were rounded up, that were not in mixed marriages or in hiding, were rounded up, and we went back to Westerbork. And from there, they were shipping people out. This is also at the time when Anne Frank, pretty much at that time, was also ended up first going to Westerbork, and then she and her family ended up going to Bergen-Belsen, and her father ended up in Auschwitz at that time. And we were literally in the last roundup in Holland at that time. And it was the last 5,000 that were basically rounded up and out of all the people. So the only Jews that were left are those that were in mixed marriages and those that were in hiding, really. And so we went back to Theresienstadt. We went back to Westerbork, and we were there for several days until they had a roundup. And then they sent us. We were sent to Theresienstadt. And the reason we ended up at Theresienstadt was because of that citizenship papers. Without that, and my view is that saved our lives. Now, Theresienstadt was a ghetto, but before that, it was a fortress that was built in the 1790s. Maria Theresa Fortress, Austrian, was part of Austria. And Theresienstadt is in Czechoslovakia. Okay. Right near the German border. And it had been a fortress, and then it became a garrison town, and then I think they also used it as a prison. And there were about somewhat 7,000 or 8,000 civilians living there. In 1941, they drove the civilians out, and pretty much out. 1941, yes. And they set it up as a concentration camp, a small concentration camp, as well as a ghetto. And if you go today, you see two welcome, it's still there. A welcome sign, one direction was the ghetto, the other direction was the concentration camp. The concentration camp was not for Jews. It was meant for foreign workers that, people, whatever, was locals and whatever. And there were several thousand of them. The ghetto was really built, as I said, so they drove the civilians out, and they started shipping people there. Originally, it was for the Jews in Czechoslovakia. So close to 100,000 Jews ended up there from Czechoslovakia over a period of time. Very few of those survived. So at the height, the numbers varied because they would take a certain number and they'd build wood barracks on top of it as well. And at the height, they had, at any one time, they had like 50 or more thousand people there. In total, 150,000 Jews went through the ghetto. The ghetto, initially, we lived in barracks as well. We were separated. My mother and I lived together, and my brother at that time was, and this is in 1944, lived with my father in the barracks. And eventually, as they shipped more people out to Auschwitz, at that point, the population declined, and then they gave us one room in a 5-room officers' quarters, what used to be the officers' quarters, a 5-room apartment. And we were sharing a bathroom and the kitchen facilities with 4 other families at that point. So, so we had the one room. So relatively speaking, we were well off, okay? There was eventually a movie made of it in September. Well, there was a visit by the Swedish Red Cross before we got there. And they had cleaned it up. They had set up a center for playing soccer, and they had a swimming pool for a while. They had cafeteria and stuff like that. And they did the Swedish and Czech Red Cross came through there and saw the place and said, okay, because they were using it for propaganda. And then they were going to make a movie as well. That never got off the ground, but they started the movie in September. And by the time we got there in September of 1944, my brother mentioned to me that they still had the dining halls open for a while, but by October everything was gone. But by that time they started shipping all the people out. As I said, there were 150,000 people that went through Theresienstadt. Of that group, roughly 15,000 survived. 30,000 died there from disease and malnutrition of the 150,000, which is similar to what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. Over 100,000 died there from disease and malnutrition. And the small fortress that I was talking about, the concentration camp, was also used as a punishment for Jews in the ghetto that broke the rules and so forth. But when we got there, before we got there, my mother had sewn money, had gotten through the black market, I think she got dollars or marks, one or the other, I don't remember exactly what, and had sewn it into her sewing yarn, the spools. And because we know that if you had money, you could bribe the guards, and they were trying to, so one of the things they also did, they told you to bring your personal possessions when we were taken. So whatever we had, and there wasn't that much with clothes and everything like that. And then they would, anything extraneous, any jewelry or anything like that you may have had, which was already taken before, they would take from you. And they were ready to take this sewing kit, and she finally convinced them to let her keep it. Eventually, my father ended up working in a laboratory, another laboratory in the camp. My brother was kind of, for most of the time, he contracted tuberculosis, so he spent most of the time in the hospital. My mother ended up working in the hospital because so many people had been sent away. And so one of the things they did in the hospital, if someone died, they wouldn't tell the Germans. And you have to understand, the ghettos were run by the Jews under the control of the Nazis, or the Germans. And that was the way the ghettos all ran. They went back to the old ghetto system. So the hospital was run by them, the food distribution, all of that stuff was done that way. And they ran a daycare also. So since both of my parents were working, I ended up being in the daycare. But in a sense, what happened next? So my mother got a job in the hospital, and they would not tell the Germans that somebody died. So they would distribute the rations to other people, to the staff and so forth. And they could do that a couple of days, but enough people, so that helped. My father worked in a laboratory, and he was, which I didn't understand, he didn't understand either, but he was testing flour. Because they brought food in flour and they had to test it. And so they smuggled some of that out into the community as well, as much as they could. At one point, though, they rounded everybody in the laboratory and sent them to prison there, and didn't tell them why. And they were there for several days, and they were afraid they were going to be shipped out. And as it happened, they were never told why, and then they were allowed to go back to their quarters, and never, just like that. So I don't know what the Germans were looking for or not, because the prison was in this small fortress, and that's also was the execution site in that prison. They had its own execution site. The other thing that the Theresienstadt had, and you can still see it, is a crematorium. So a lot of camps had crematoriums as well as and the reason being very simply, and this came in, people were dying so fast that and the weather wasn't the greatest for burying people. So they built a crematorium. That became pretty standard throughout all the camps. And you can still see them. You can see them in Dachau. You can see it at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was only one part of Auschwitz was a death camp, by the way. That was Birkenau. But in any event, how am I doing on time? I'm good? Okay, fine?
15 more minutes to
Oh yeah, no, that'll be fine. So we ended up, so they had, most of the 30,000 that died there were cremated eventually. And then later on, before the Russians came, we were liberated by the Russians, and they had a depository for the ashes. And before the Russians came, they threw the ashes into the river that was running right by there, because they didn't want the Russians to know how many people had died there. This was the model ghetto. I mean, you have to understand, and this was the place to be, right? One of the things about the ghettos, you wore civilian clothes. We did not wear stripes. We were not tattooed or anything like that. By the way, the only camp that tattooed was Auschwitz, in the concentration camps. If you're going to a gas chamber, forget about it. You never made it that far. They took you off the trains directly to the gas chamber, and they built the railroad tracks right into the gas chamber. You've seen pictures of that. Many of you probably have seen that. So, but Auschwitz, we never know why the first commandant decided to tattoo people. They didn't need it. They had a record. They had a numbering system. They used IBM machines, key punch machines. Some of us are familiar with them, to maintain their records. And so I have copies of our transport orders to the camp. You know, when we arrived in Theresienstadt, I got it there when we visited, and I have a copy of that as well, showing exactly when we arrived, our names with a number that we had. So we were kind of stuck. Even at the end, my father was very concerned in December or October, when they were doing the mass roundups of Jews in the camp, that we would be sent out as well. But apparently they said, because there were different people there, there were Danish Jews there that came in 1943. There were other foreign nationals who were there, Jewish foreign nationals, but none of the ones that were there, they were not sent to Auschwitz. But for a while, my father thought, these papers, whether or not these papers would survive, will be enough. In fact, there were times when other Germans did not recognize the paper, so there was a mixed bag as to, fortunately, where we were, they were accepted, even to the end. So, so this takes us right up to the time, pretty much to the end of the war. The camp was liberated officially by the Russians on May 8th, 1945. But the Germans ran away several days before, and the Red Cross came in to take over running the camp until the Russians came in. Russians came in, and they were not, it was kind of interesting. It was mind-boggling. It was an eye-opener for my father, the way he described it, because the soldiers were like 19th century at that point. They didn't know what a bicycle was and things like that. Many of them were taken off the farms and so forth. We were there for several weeks. Let me back up one moment, something else. In April of 1945, we received about 15,000 Jews coming from other camps. This is what they used to call the Death March. That's famous. And we were the recipients, probably the last recipients of people from the Death March. They were moving Jews from camps as they were being liberated, not so much out of Poland, because most of those were the Russians, but they were moving it as they were giving up, as the camps were being liberated by the Americans and others. They would move a lot of these people out that had been, some of them were originally from Auschwitz. So they've been on the road often. And when they came to us, they were quarantined, fortunately, because they were diseased, many of them mentally incapable of doing anything else. So you could hear them scream at night and stuff like that. But fortunately, they were isolated from us. And these were the ones that were in striped uniforms. These are the ones that had, many of them were like barely alive by the time they got to us. And quite a few of them did not survive. Also, what happened at the end of the war, disease became very rampant in all of the camps. Typhoid, or I guess was the primary one, typhoid. And so many people died from that in the camps as well. And this was pretty standard. Part of it was the crematoriums were no longer stopped working because they didn't even have fuel anymore for them. So when they, so they liberated them and so forth. So that happened. Then, so our camp was liberated, but we stayed there for several weeks, pretty much until the end of May. And then we were turned over to the Americans, probably because of these papers and because we were also from Western Europe. And then we ended up ending up in a DP camp. And the interesting side point was we were in a DP camp, walled in with fences and so forth. And when they saw that we had these papers from us, oh, you're American, you can go into town. They allowed us to go into town, in a local town there. And then in June of 1945, we were transported flown back to Amsterdam. And we ended up getting an apartment from, again, through my father's company that was originally by a Dutch Nazi sympathizer, or similar to that worked with the Germans. So we got that apartment. We lived in that until we came to the United States. But we did, so that's how it. My brother started going back to school. My father went back to work immediately. My brother went to school, and I went back to school. He was in his last year of secondary school. Not quite, I'm sorry. He was in secondary school, but went into. So things went somewhat normal. We was on rationing the whole time we were there. And then in 1948, the Russians were on the move. We had been exposed to them. My father didn't like that. My brother graduated secondary school, and we had no family left there. We had relatives in the United States. So we ended up immigrating to the United States in July of 1948, ended up in a place called Paterson, New Jersey, because that's where my aunt ended up living. And so from there, it was pretty straightforward. Then my father wanted to set up a laboratory on his own, and he did that. And that's where we lived. I spoke German and Dutch. I did not speak English, so they put me in a Jewish Y camp since it was summer. And I spoke German, and they spoke Yiddish to me. And then in September, I started school. They didn't have English as a second language or anything like that. So I had to assimilate very quickly, which I did. Obviously, you had no choice. So from there, it was the standard American life. After that, it was pretty straightforward. I think I'm running out of time.
You're wrapping up. You're good.
Fun?
You're fine.
Okay. Yeah. All right. But from there, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, my brother spoke English with a British accent because he went to school. But I was too young at that point. So it was kind of funny because my aunt my parents did speak English also, so it wasn't that. So my aunt, but my mother didn't speak it as well as my aunt, who had been there from 1942 or so. So we ended up, she took me to the school with my mother, and they had papers in English, but it wasn't clear whether I was going into the fourth grade or I was coming out of the fourth grade. So my aunt quickly spoke up, no, he's coming out of the fourth grade. When in fact I was only coming out of, I was going into the fourth grade, which didn't make any difference because when it came to general subjects, science, math, and everything, I was far ahead of anybody in the United States because the schooling is much more rigorous. The public schooling in Europe is more rigorous than the United States. And I still had to learn English. So I started off with comic books and stuff like that, children's books. But from there, we took up the normal life. And so that's basically my story as far as I went to university. I went to Columbia undergraduate in New York. And then I went and one of the reasons I went there, they offered Navy ROTC because at that time there was a mandatory draft. And I said, I'm not going in the Army, and I like water. And so then I was commissioned and spent over 4 years active duty, and I spent 30 years in the reserves. And when I retired down here, I was 55. I worked for I had a finance degree and an advanced degree, and I worked running financial departments for Price Waterhouse and Arthur Young. And then I also became executive directors of several law firms. And as I said, we came down here in 1994. And I'm also very fortunate because I have 3 children. 2 of them live in Naples, and one of them lives on the East Coast in Cooper City, which, for those that don't know, it is right across. It's right off 75, just south of where it turns off from Fort Lauderdale. And so for them, it's like an hour and a half. So, and that's unusual for retirees in Florida, that's to say the least. I've been very active down here. I've been active with the foster care areas for dependency court, the temple, the museum, and stuff like that, and Hadassah for a while, and so forth. And we've always done a lot of stuff down here. So that's basically it. All I can tell you is we were fortunate that so many survived, that we survived out of it. And fortunately, some of our family made it into the United States before the war. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, that's a fascinating story, Rob, and thank you so much.
Well, it's not as dramatic as many others, to say the least. But it's a different perspective because, people from Western Europe, it's the same thing with my sister-in-law. They were kicked out. They were Polish. They were kicked out in the 30s. They ended up in France, went through a similar thing. Her parents were rounded up in July of 43. Her brother was in the French underground. She was smuggled out down to southern France. She has relatives that made it to Cuba, then came in 1961 or 1661 and settled in Miami and New York and so forth. So we all have different stories.
Yes.
I would give one of the things I like to mention. There's a site called Sousa Mendes site Foundation. And this was the person that was not the one, but he was one of the ones. He was Portuguese, and Portugal was neutral. That gave out visas to a lot of Jews in France. But they run programs, weekly programs through Zoom. And there are others that, the different museums, we run programs, Holocaust, there are different programs that are being run by different organizations. So that might be something people might be interested in if they want to find out more. And most of the programs are free. You just have to register.
Did you feel, I wanted to ask you when you were talking about that the Holocaust Museum has recorded many stories of survivors. Do many of them come forward on their own because they want to share their stories, or is it through word of mouth that you learn of people?
I think there was a trend. My parents spoke when we were up north, started speaking to my schools and stuff like that. But what changed for many people was the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. That, I think, my father sent his story in there. He was 90 years old when he wrote it, and sent it to him. And I have copies, and I used to give the kids copies of that as well. My brother lived in New Jersey pretty much his whole life since coming, but he became a snowbird and lived in a place called Sunny Isles on the East Coast. That's right in, used to be North Miami or Beach or whatever, right on the beach there, near the beach. I think our involvement came about when the museum opened up. We started opening it up, and that's when we started. And that's where I became a docent there in 2005. And we've become more active. But we've also been very active in Hadassah and other organizations with Israel and so forth. And we have relatives in Israel, but that actually their parents came from Poland and finally made it to Israel.
What would you say was your primary motivation for beginning to share your story?
I think that people, when you start thinking about it, that this has to be told. And I view the Holocaust, telling my story, as a means of expressing this is what happened, but it's a learning experience. Because much of what's happening today with the displaced, I tell people this, why I do it, but our idea is to teach acceptance. When I go into the schools, particularly in the schools here in Collier County, many of them are very diverse. Half the kids, English is the second language. They're blacks, Hispanics, and so forth. But these are often poorer schools that you would not consider. And the difference in schools is dramatic in Collier County. And it reflects the socioeconomic background. I saw it in the court system. I'm still involved in that. But this type of thing is still going on. The bullying and everything like this is where it comes from. And what you're seeing, particularly now, you're seeing resurgence of a lot of the stuff that happened before. And we try to reach the children, but the problem you often have when we get to them, it's sometimes 8th graders, sometimes it's too late because they're learning it from their parents. And, if you're raised with that, it just passes on. So we're really hoping generationally it works its way down. And we're doing more and more. We're doing more outreach on the human rights issues. It's not just the Holocaust. It's not just about the Jews. When people talk the Holocaust and refer to the Jews, you should understand that of the 12 million that died as quote-unquote part of the Holocaust, only half were Jewish or so forth. And people don't think about it that way. The Poles, there were almost 2 million Polish civilians that died in the Holocaust because they were being used as slave labor. And why were they being used as slave labor? Because the Germans, the Aryans, quote unquote, and which refers, by the way, to the Germanic tribes. The word Aryan, it refers specifically to the Germanic tribe. It's not white, per se white. Viewed Slavs as second class. That was the mindset of the Aryans. They are superior. And that's why there were special relationships with them, with the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Danish, because they were considered also Aryan. And the Dutch were considered Aryan, and the French basically were considered Aryan, and the British were. So they were not treated the same way, as the others. That didn't, so the death rate was, but, Holland had one of the highest rates. About 75% of all the Jews in Holland before the war died in the Holocaust. In Poland, it was over 90%. So, you're talking numbers that are...
Oh, huge. Yeah.
But, and I keep telling people that when I do a tour, I did one last Sunday, in fact, we're still doing some of them, sometimes when we get enough people. But I was telling them, this can happen anywhere. And that's the lesson, and that's what we're trying to say. And much of it starts from people that were raised with these beliefs. And this is the and I relate to that to the 2 weeks ago to the Congress, what they were doing.
Yeah.
This is what was happening in Germany. The burning of the Reichstag was done by the Germans, and used that as an excuse to go after it. The first concentration camps were opened up. Dachau was one of the first. There were several of them in May of 1933, and they were not for the Jews. They were for political opponents. So that's the lessons from it. People forget about when I used to when I was 15 years ago, 10 years ago. The big thing was Darfur. And now you never hear about Darfur. And yet it's still going. People are still in camps, and they're still dying, and there's this low-grade accident. So it could be anything. Yeah. It's genocide in one form or another.
Yeah.
Rob, how did you said you were comfortable, but how did you survive that? And so many didn't. Did you get fed? There was no heat?
No, within the ghetto you had rations. Actually, we had ration cards. We had money.
Okay.
In the ghettos, you had money. It's worthless, but you had money. And you could buy stuff, the stuff, but obviously. Some of the pictures, you'd have like soup kitchens almost type of stuff. The Jewish councils ran the camp. In the concentration camps often was different because often, and this is where Schindler comes in, the story about Schindler. In the concentration camps, food was provided, the rationing, but the rations were controlled. And most of the companies basically rented the workers from the Germans and then were responsible for them in many ways. And they couldn't care less if they died or whatever, because the Germans would give them round up more people. So the Nuremberg trials was the first time that German businessmen were put on trial as part of the Nuremberg trials. So that was part of the why that was unique. So Holocaust is a unique name. The word genocide came out of it. And eventually the International Criminal Court came out of it as well. And unfortunately, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. And the rationale behind that was we will take care of our own. They didn't want to turn over sovereignty of our soldiers or, to foreign governments. And that was the rationale for that. It's also interesting because one of the things that you have the United Nations. Well, before that, there was a thing called the League of Nations that was formed. And the United States was not a member of the League of the Nations either. Before the same reason, they didn't want to get involved. And the other thing that I want to stress, which ties into what happened with Kristallnacht at least, there was a conference in July of 1938 where the 32 countries came to Evian, France. It was initiated by Roosevelt. And basically the Germans came there and said, take my Jews. Now, there were only about 300,000 Jews left, or 200,000 in Germany at that point, and so forth. And we were talking basically Germany and Austria at that point. So between the two of them, there had been about 600,000, 700,000. And many of them got out. The Polish Jews were shipped out back to Poland, many of them primarily, or to other countries. But Germany, and none of the 32 countries offered to take the Jews. And when a good example of that is a thing, if people want to read up on, is the ship St. Louis in May of 1939, which was turned back. And the United States, there were 900 Jews on it. They had temporary visas to get into Cuba. Once they got there, they were not, only 20 some were allowed to land. Ships sailed along the coast of Miami for 11 days while the communities tried to allow these people to come in. Anti-Semitism was strong in the United States. And it is growing again because, and that the State Department, particularly among the State Department, the biggest benefactor to the Jews was Roosevelt, not the president, his wife. Yeah, she was very supportive.
So, Rob, I wanted to ask, I have two questions.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor.
Yes.
Eleanor, right.
I had a senior moment. I lose these things.
Oh, we do too.
Fine?
We have senior moments too.
Oh, I mean,
Also.
they don't get better. I'm sorry.
So, did you also get a law degree?
No, I got an MBA. I got a
but you have all this. A director of a law firm. And
the executive directors of the law firms are not lawyers.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, most of them.
Yeah.
Many of them are finance people.
Interesting.
Because that's the one. It's hard to deal with lawyers. They admit that they don't know finance.
Oh, there you go. And what about? I may have missed something in what you said. So you were German. But why were you not?
I was not German.
You were not German. You would.
One of the papers that's on that, and you could see it if you'd like. You could see it. Right, I have it with me also in hard copy here. It was the certificate of citizenship. Okay, my U.S. citizenship papers show my prior nationality as El Salvador.
El Salvador. Okay.
Because, as I said, birthright.
Because
I was stateless.
You weren't born in Germany.
I was born in Holland.
Right.
I was never Dutch.
Oh, that's right. You were born in Holland.
I finally, just as an aside, we were transported, just as an aside, bring it current. In last year, I got substantial amount of money from the Dutch railway system. So they started pretty much 75 years after the end of the war. Not the government, but the Dutch railway system accepted responsibility for that they were complicit with the Germans as far as the transportation, because Dutch trains were used to take people to concentration camps.
Oh my goodness.
And Dutch crews and so forth. So if you were a survivor or a child of survivors who had gone through that, you got compensation. 75 years after the end of the war.
I guess my question was going to be, why would you not, or were you not considered part of the Aryan race?
Yeah. Jews were considered...
Why? What did they have against the Jews, I guess?
Anti-Semitism is in many places, because one of the things, historically, Jews were not allowed to own land in many places. So they went into the trades, they went into the professions, they became doctors. In modern Europe, they became, it was kind of interesting. I read like a third of the doctors in Warsaw, or more than about half of the doctors in Warsaw were Jewish. Because they focused on education, and that's what happened in the United States. For Jews coming in, the Jews that came in initially started working that were the immigrants. The first generations went into business. The Jews and it's interesting because the Jews came in two waves, major parts. One was in the 1850s with the famines in Europe and the political situation in Europe. That's when the Irish came as well. Okay, same time. These are the ones that actually went out west, most of them. And ended up, many of them, so the largest Jewish population in the 1850s was in Cincinnati. And that's why the Reform movement is headquartered in Cincinnati. They were the ones that were moved west, many of them, and formed, and also in New York and so forth. But they formed a lot of the department stores, if you see where they come from. And these were founded by Jews because they went out as peddlers.
Right.
And they needed people. So that's how many of them started out. They were farmers. Many of them came off to, worked. And but the same happened with Irish. So, but anti-Semitism up till the 1800s was religious.
I was going to say it was religion in Europe. So you were ostracized?
No, but that started. But in the 1800s, as people turned away from religion, it became ethnic and formalized in many ways. So that made it even more difficult because you can give up your religion, as my aunt by marriage did, whatever. She was actually an aunt to my wife, my mother. She could become a nun and so forth and get killed because she was still Jewish.
I was going to say it didn't matter.
And it's kind of interesting. There's a whole article about it even, that there were people that were Nazis that had Jewish blood in them. But they were far enough removed. And I think in order to be a member of the Nazi party or something, it had to be from somebody prior to 1750 or some ridiculous time. So, and the basic rule for being considered Jewish in Germany, if 3 out of 4 grandparents were Jewish, you were Jewish. And then they have a whole chart, if you ever look at it, how they classified people. And this is part of the Nuremberg race laws that came in effect in 1935. And then if 2 out of them, then you were half. You were considered mixed. And then if it's only 1 out of your grandparents, and it's based on your grandparents as of 1935. So there were people that were in the German army, obviously, that were considered. And there was one of the leaders of the Nazi party was Jewish, was considered by one person at least. And I'm a close friend of Hitler. But he was one of the founders of the Nazi party. Goebbels did not consider him as German. He considered him, even though it goes back to before that, well before that. Under German law, he was considered a non-Jew, but under party law, he still considered him Jewish. And Hitler told him, forget it, because he was in the government, So it's kind of crazy.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
And one was, I know you were really young at the time, but do you have any distinct memories of that 36-hour train ride from Westerbork to Theresienstadt?
Not really that much. I do know for a fact the weather was good, so it was not a problem. It wasn't that crowded in there, so, but all we had was a slop bucket. We had some water and so forth, no food or anything like that. So they gave us some food when we left, when we were so it's not as if we didn't have any in our personal. So while we were in Westerbork, it was relatively fine.
A couple of years ago, my husband and I went to Prague, and we took the day trip to Terezin, which I believe is part of...
That is Theresienstadt.
Right. So I did see, and I actually saw the promotional, film that they made. They showed it to the visitors of how it was presented to the outside world, unrealistically. And we saw the rooms where they had multiple wooden.
But what you saw was the little fortress,
Yes.
which was a concentration camp,
Yes.
not the ghetto. Mm-hmm. The museum, you went to the museum.
Yes.
That was the headquarters of the Germans.
Okay.
And that was in the ghetto. And now you have a whole street, you have people, again, about 5,000 people living there, and houses and restaurants and stuff. And that was the old quarters of the people that lived there before.
One of the things that I thought was the most poignant in that museum was they had a lot of letters, pieces of paper where the children who were there had filled out, and many of them were reminiscing about their lives before they were there, and I mean, it was just.
Did you get to the Jewish cemetery in Prague?
No.
Okay.
I didn't.
The Jewish cemetery, the first time we were there, we didn't get to it. The second time, Prague had a very strong Jewish community, which was not destroyed. But there was no ghetto there. Krakow is in Poland, so there was no ghetto. Krakow is another city in Poland, which was a ghetto, which was Schindler's List. Mm-hmm. And that survived. So you could see remnants of the wall. You could see. You could go to Schindler's factory. It's a museum now. So the Jewish quarters there, the synagogues, the original synagogues in the areas around there. In Warsaw, all of that is gone because in 1944 there was an uprising in Warsaw. Also, they destroyed the ghetto, but then they also destroyed much of Warsaw in the Germans, there was an uprising of the Polish people, not Jews, and about 80,000 people died in that uprising. And this is Warsaw, and they destroyed the city, much of the central city in that uprising. And the Russians were right across the river from Warsaw and watched it happen.
Wow.
And the Poles thought they would come in and help, but they didn't. And then when they finally, after the war, and the Russians moved in January of 1945, many of the leaders of the uprising, who were Polish Free French, and were taking orders from the Polish government in exile in London, they were imprisoned by the Russians. Okay.
I just have one final question. You may have
I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.
How was your family able to learn what happened to the remaining? You were saying that 15 of your family members all ended up being together in Amsterdam, but only really your immediate family survived. How were you able to learn the fate?
Well, we knew they died. Some ended up in Theresienstadt. Most end up in other camps, but we don't necessarily know where they ended up.
You just never found them again.
Pardon?
You never found another trace of them.
No, my grandfather, no, there are records of them, I'm sure.
Yeah.
We never went back and really, these were cousins,
Right.
rather than immediate.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them were from on my father's side. But it was kind of interesting because there's a whole section, and I don't know who's familiar with New York City, the West End.
Yeah.
That's where the Jews,
Yes.
There were a lot of Jews there, and that's where quite a few of my family members ended up, Washington Heights and West End.
Yep. I'm right next to Patterson.
What?
My other home is right next to Patterson.
Which one?
Well, right now I live here, but up there it's Paramus.
Oh, sure.
But next to Patterson, pretty much I would go to Patterson often, was a little Dutch town, Midland Park.
Yeah.
And then Midland Park was surrounded by Wyckoff and Ridgewood, Paramus.
Yeah, well, I lived
So it's just across the bridge.
We
to
lived in Patterson. But in '53 we moved out to Fairlawn.
Oh, I'm next to Fairlawn.
Yeah.
Right off. My road becomes Fairlawn Avenue.
Yeah.
Where I am now, it's a
So we
condo.
lived in the Warren Point, which is Route 4.
Yes, I know Warren Point.
And we have relatives there now in Fair Lawn. We have relatives in, that's my wife's family is from Clifton. So
Okay.
Passaic and Clifton.
Surprised.
That's extraneous.
Yes, surprised. I was startled when you said that.
No, but that's...
Well, unless there's something else you'd like to add, Rob, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us. And we'd also like to thank Sam Parrish from the Holocaust Museum for helping set this up for us.
Sam is great.
He is great. We spent
Yeah,
a lot of
he
emails
is-
and a lot of time on the phone.
Yeah, no,
Lovely man.
I said, look, I'd be happy to talk to him, you know, because
Yep.
a lot of times when he he goes out with the survivor. He knows with me he doesn't need to.
Oh, because I asked
So when I go to
him.
schools, I often just go by myself and so
Yeah,
forth.
I invited them both to lunch, as
Yeah.
you know, but
Right.
Rob's not eating outside. And Sam's
I
not
don't know what you
coming.
guys
No,
do.
I understand that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have friends that eat outside and we kind of wait 2 weeks.
Yeah.
After you see them.
Yeah,
I'll
exactly.
give you an example.
I do that too.
Pardon?
I do the same thing if
Yeah.
I know someone's been out.
Well, Publix is right around the corner from me. We're temporarily, we used to live, this is our like fifth place right now. We're renting right now for the year because we were in
Because of
between.
the Sienna thing.
So we were in the Carlton Lakes. We rented a house there. So that's right by, Publix, so we used that one. We used to live in Imperial, but then, and we lived all the way in the back, right next to Dallas when they finally we didn't have an exit for years. Now they had an exit. And we had that several years before we moved. Then we downsized to a place called Black Bear Ridge, which is Mission. It was right in the Island Walk. Mm-hmm. And it was very convenient. One of the reasons we did there because we were like 3 miles from the temple.
Oh, nice.
So that was, we were doing a lot, going back and forth
Right.
from North Naples down to, but so people, and so we've always lived above Pine Ridge.
Well, I'd also like to remind our members to continue to check the Windermere website for our next Cocktails and Conversation, which will be featuring one of our own members' daughters. So Sugar Rubin's daughter, Ruby Rubin, will be talking about her adventures in Borneo with working with the extinct sun bears and orangutans. So please be on the lookout for a date for that. Yes, it certainly is. So again, thank you so much, Rob.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoy doing this.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. It took a lot
particularly at this time, people,
change.
they're getting more exposed on a lot of this, but there's so many organizations that have stuff, and much of it is, I know the museum has put a lot of stuff out on YouTube, starting to put
I'll have
more
to
and
look
more
it up.
on that's
Yeah,
out there,
yeah.
programs. So, but thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Pardon?
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I enjoy doing it, obviously.
Well, it's such a valuable service. It's just,
I think one of the
you
things,
don't want people to forget about it.
yeah, and one of the things that, people ask, well, how do you overcome this? Well, when you're 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, it's one thing. My brother was affected by it more. But my parents were very positive. They always were very positive. And most of the survivors that I've met, and you've met some down here, they are very positive, outgoing and so forth. And because they made a decision, we can't look back. We can talk about it, but we can't look back. We can't live in the past. I had an aunt who one of my uncles ended up in the Shanghai ghetto. And he survived, obviously. He came to the United States and lived near us. And he ended up meeting his wife at one of the gatherings. She and her husband were there. He died there. He was a rabbi. And she came to the United States. And they would have a get-together in New York and 20 years later, she committed suicide. And she was a preschool director, camp director for the Hawaiian Passaic. and she was well thought of, and and one day, so you never know.
Stayed in her head.
Yeah. So and so that was back, and that was probably one of the hardest things for us to accept.
Sure.
But it affected, I think, my brother more than it affected. Obviously, it affected him more because he
was more aware of what was happening.
Pardon?
He was more aware of what was happening.
Well, it was more personal and more aware of it. He had some issues when he turned later on, like when he started going in his 40s. Nothing really serious, but he started taking medication for it. So, and he lived to be 86. So I guess. But it's a family of engineers. My father was an engineer. My brother's an engineer. His son, one of his sons, is an engineer, and one of his grandsons is my brother's grandsons is an engineer, and the other one is also in science. So there's.
Well, and the fact that your father was so well educated and so well regarded by his company was just huge in the outcome for your family.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an aside, when we were the first time in Western work, and my father started working with the Germans on their systems, and he ended up going back sometimes to Westerbork to help finish up because his company was involved in it. His company, so he would go back some initially.
I would think it would be also incredibly difficult that you were able to go back to Holland from Westerbork, but then had to go back a second time.
Yeah, well, we weren't there long enough. My father's primary concern was, my mother's, obviously it didn't extend to me, was whether or not we would survive.
Sure.
Because we saw so many of our friends, or my parents' friends and so forth, did not. Mm-hmm. When you consider that 75% of the Jews in Holland didn't survive, which is the highest number in Western Europe. About 50% of the German Jews survived. The survival among French Jews was higher as well, because many of them had an opportunity to hide.
I was just going to ask, did your parents know of any peers of theirs personally that went into hiding and successfully?
I don't know. I think there were about, it's estimated about somewhere 20 to some thousand went into hiding. But I think most of them were ones that spoke the language, didn't have an accent, and couldn't hide out, particularly children.
Yeah.
Children were the best. And in Holland, about 2/3 of them survived. And most of them were younger and were fluent. Mm-hmm. Older people, it was much more difficult to hide. Because in France, we have people there. And I mean, if you want to, there's some that their stories are in France where they were hidden, or they were taken in by families, or they were they ended up, there's one here that ended up in a convent and stuff like that, or in a hospital, were taken care of by nuns and so forth. And the French were more lackadaisical about keeping records. Okay.
That's interesting.
My sister-in-law was, as I said, my brother-in-law was in the French underground, and his family still lives in France.
Is that right?
My sister-in-law ended up, she was, at the time, she was 11, and they got her down to southern France, to Bordeaux, and then she was in hiding, and eventually she was taken in and was hidden. And then she came back to Paris and went into an orphanage.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and then her brother finally got her. She came to the United States a couple of years after we did. So as I said, the more in France, the more of them survived. Many of them were smuggled out also. with false papers. There were Americans that helped. There was an American on Hiram Bingham. I don't know how much you know about Machu Picchu.
A little. I mean, I haven't been there.
No, the person that discovered it was his father, I guess. When they first discovered, he was into archaeology, and he was in the State Department, being in France, consul in Marseille, and he helped smuggle Jews out of there against the express orders of the U.S. This is before the U.S. was still, before 1941.
Before they were in the war.
Yeah, in 1940-41. And he never got promoted after that. Because, it became common knowledge that he helped Jews.
That he helped Jews.
So, what can I say?